my intention is really to set the scene here, no? And so I will do an attempt at at least providing examples of what drivers behind the economic vulnerability of farming may be. And towards the end of the presentation, I will provide a very brief overview of possible ways of addressing economic vulnerability of farming. But I'm going to leave the floor and the opportunity to DG Agri to spend much more time on this, because I know they want to tell you lots of details there. So we can go to the next slide, please. Really to set the scene, I think this is not news really to any of you, because I think that's why you're here. But being a farmer is almost, at least from my understanding, per definition, to be economically vulnerable. Because on average, at the EU level, agricultural income is about half of the average wages in the whole economy. So as a starting point, you have, let's say, less maybe economic margin than what you do in many other economic sectors. And on top of that, of course, you're constantly exposed to external impacts, whether this being the market fluctuations in relation to the prices that you obtain for your products, or if it's the market fluctuations that influence the production costs because your input prices are varying. And then, of course, you're also very much in the hands of the weather gods. Agriculture is, of course, more affected by weather and climate conditions compared to other sectors of the economy. And in addition, it's also the case that in many member states, in general, the access to financing is more limited for farmers than it is for other economic sectors for various reasons. And this hinders, of course, the investments in improvements and advances. So if we go to the next slide, please. In other words, being a farmer, as I started by saying, is almost synonymous to being subject to, or it is synonymous to being subject to external impacts. And so sometimes this causes you to be economically vulnerable. And this is the case for the agriculture sector in the EU as a whole. However, there are segments of the sector that we may consider to be more vulnerable than others, or more likely to be subject to vulnerabilities in the future due to emerging drivers. Now, this varies. This is not a constant. So it varies between member states. It varies between regions within the member states, or between geographical areas within a member state. It varies between the different agriculture sectors. It varies between size segments of the sectors, and so on. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. So I think economic vulnerability is not a constant, and it varies. It can also vary depending on farmers' preparedness, and so maybe their ability to collaborate or cooperate with others, their training, their preparedness, their knowledge, the skill level, and of course it also varies over time. So all this to say that, of course, there are external and there are internal drivers of economic vulnerability of farming. And just a few examples, if we go to the next slide, please. I don't really want to go into detail here, but just to say, for example, what this slide shows you is that the agricultural income per what we call annual work unit, so that's the equivalent to the work of one person working full-time for 1 year, is generally lower in the smaller and medium farm sizes. So that would mean, on average, you say, of course, you're smaller or you're a medium-sized farm, you have less margin, so you're more economically vulnerable. However, there's always a but to this. Small farms are also, at least in some member states, more likely to be economically diversified. So they may have other income sources outside of agriculture, hence allowing them to have to get this economic margin to improve. So it's not a rocket science, but you can say that smaller, medium-sized farms may be more economically vulnerable. Next slide, please. And here we look at the gross farm income per farming sector. And again, what you see here, really the main takeaway that I want you to look at is the variation between farm sectors of income. So in this case here, you see that the lowest gross income levels are really observed in the sheep and goat sectors and the mixed livestock sectors. You also see low income levels in the permanent crops, wine, fruits, olives, and so on. In particular, the EU dairy and cattle farming sectors are really quite heavily reliant on direct income support from the CAP. The dairy farmers' income relies on CAP payments for about 70% of their income. And for beef, that's even 100%. Of course, the economic vulnerability in this case is also higher because they depend on feed as an input, which is feed is susceptible to price fluctuations and, of course, global trade dynamics. However, again, as for small farms, it's not the case that all livestock farmers are worse off. No, there are really large differences in income levels that are being observed across member states and regions and across different farm sizes within these sectors. So in general, what you can say is maybe that the more specialized farms are generally showing higher income per annual work unit. So again, just to show you, this may be the case, but it's not always the case. Next slide, please. We also have then farms that are located in mountainous areas or areas that suffer from some form of natural constraints. These natural constraints can include factors like there may be poor soil quality, there may be harsher climatic conditions, maybe mountainous terrain, there may be limited water availability, other factors. Now, all of this which make farming more difficult or less productive. So, as a result, if you're a farmer in a disadvantaged area, then you also often face higher costs and lower yields, which leads to reduced income. Again, making these farmers more at risk of being economically vulnerable. Again, there's great variability, so I'm not saying that this is always the case, but I'm saying there are many situations where farmers in these areas are, let's say, more at risk. Then if we go to next slide, please. Then we have what we all know, climate change. We know climate change is projected to increase the intensity and frequency of climate-related shocks, as well as the level of uncertainty related to such risk, and can be expected to, even more than is currently the case, compound the pressure from other risks. And of course, there's also resource scarcity, which is expected to contribute to increasing uncertainties in the agriculture sector, including, for example, water use. And although I would say that farmers are increasingly aware of the risks facing agriculture, we are still observing that many are not taking sufficient actions to improve their resilience, to improve prevention, risk management. If we go to the next slide, just a map, which I'm sure many of you have come across. Well, this shows you, it's an aggregated map of the expected changes in crop yields across Europe for three main crops, for wheat, for maize, for soybeans. And these estimates there include the effects on crop yield of changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, and changes in CO2 concentration. So what you see from this map is really that the regional pattern of projected impacts from climate change is quite clear. It generally shows that we have improved conditions in Northern Europe and worse conditions in Southern Europe. because there's an increased drought stress and the shortening of the active growing season, which is a clear indication of the deteriorating agroclimatic conditions in Central and Southern Europe. And also in some areas of Southern Europe, the higher temperatures that are expected to come about and increasing drought risks, they are expected to reduce livestock production through negative impacts on both grassland and on animal health. So to sum up, that the predicted climate changes favor a northward expansion of suitable cropping areas, while in southern areas of the EU, increases in water shortages and extreme weather events are likely to contribute to a reduction in suitable areas for traditional crops. So again, another example of where and in what sectors we may increasingly see economically vulnerable farms in the future. So we go to the next slide, please. Here, an attempt of really summarizing the the drivers of economic vulnerability of farming. I'm saying that word so many times that I'm now getting stuck on it. Climate change that I just discussed. Now, really, the extreme weather and the resource scarcity and how that influences farmers. Then we have the economic factors, the market volatility, which impacts both output prices, but also input prices. Trade policies, geopolitics. Now, of course, for sectors or areas that are more trade dependent, this is a very important factor for impacting the instability maybe of your income. And then we have the technological change challenges, which, although I'd say all of the external drivers here impact all of the agricultural sector, maybe technological challenges are a stronger concern for the smaller, medium-sized farms, unless, if keeping up with technological advancement is maybe particularly challenging for the less resource-intensive farms. If you lack training, if you lack knowledge, preparedness, then you also have more difficulties in accessing finance, and then it's harder, of course, to invest in innovation and access technology. So all this really was my introduction here to set the stage and to ideally spark the discussion that we're going to have in the breakout sessions in a while. But just before we do that, a few words to give you an overview on the potential responses to these drivers. So if we go to the next slide, please. And we can actually go to one more step. Because, of course, there are many things that farmers and businesses can do on their own to increase their preparedness against economic vulnerability. However, here today, as with the CAP network, and we're discussing the role also of future policy in the field, I put the emphasis on what the current policy responses are to economic vulnerability of farming. And as you can see, there's a wide spectrum of tools available both through the CAP and through national policies. These are just examples that I put up here. And if you look at the CAP strategic plans for the 2023 to 27 period, member states have chosen different strategies depending on the needs that were identified and the tools that were considered the most appropriate to address the needs. So we have, for example, then the direct payments, now the cornerstone of many farmers' income. This, of course, includes the basic income support, which is available to all farmers that respect the good agricultural and environmental conditions. But then you have the complementary redistributive income support, which you can target to the smaller farms if you consider these to be the most, let's say, economically vulnerable. You have the coupled income support, which you can target to specific sector. You also have sectoral support, which with the latest reform, you can now make available to pretty much any agricultural sector and target it there in a way that it may allow you also in the longer term to, if not overcome the economic vulnerability, at least help treating it if you want. You have the rural development support, where you have the support for areas with natural constraints. You have support for areas with specific disadvantages. You have, of course, a risk management toolbox with support for insurance schemes, mutual funds. You have investment support, which allows you to support investments in all kinds of fields. And you have the environmental climate support, allowing you in particular to maybe support adaptation measures in relation to climate change. You may also choose to use financial instruments through the CAP, which, in addition to the grants, then allow you to increase the access to finance for specific segments of the agricultural sector. And you have the market measures, which reduce the exposure to price volatility for the agricultural sector as a whole. Finally, as I said, you have national policies, and there we've seen many examples, but maybe most relevant for today is the insurance schemes that are being supported nationally in many member states. And of course, there are tax regulations and exemptions in many different ways, which may also help. Now, this is really a very, very quick overview. If we go to the next slide, I just want to leave you with one final message. And it's really to say that how one defines economic vulnerability and the vulnerabilities that one considers most urgent to address that will define the policy response. Hence, the wide spectra of options that we've observed in the CAP strategic plans.